The process of star formation commences when a molecular cloud or a nebula is disturbed. It's shaken out of its state of balance, its state of tranquility, its state of hydrostatic equilibrium, where all of its internal forces are carefully balanced against each other. This disruption can occur as the result of any number of cosmological events, such as when two molecular clouds collide with each other, or it can be the result of a shock wave from a supernova explosion. Whatever the case, the disruption essentially fragments the molecular cloud. It splits it into various sections. Each of these sections becomes a kind of stellar birthing room, because within each section, the dust and the gas of the cloud begin to rotate rapidly around a central point. This central point that forms in the middle of each section is a kind of knot of gas, a kind of a dense knot of gas and dust that becomes a kind of stellar embryo. And with around that dense knot of dust and gas, the cloud begins to spin, kind of like how pizza dough can spin around the finger of a pizza maker. The dust and the gas get flattened out, and yet there's that kind of core gravitational point within the middle. That core point, that dense knot, is what's known as the protostar. And I'm going to be relating the protostar with the point 1 or the type 1 on the Enneagram. As the section of the molecular cloud begins to collapse under gravitational pressure, and as it begins to spin more rapidly, it gets increasingly hotter. The hotter it gets, the faster it spins, and the more it contracts. Due to the disruption of the molecular cloud, essentially gravity starts to win out, and it's gravity that's bringing all of the gas and the dust together into that central point, that protostar at the middle of that collapsing section of cloud. As the protostar increases in density, its temperature increases and the star contracts even more. So the protostar is in effect shrinking even as it's getting more and more compact. The protostar has not yet developed its own energy generating capacity like a full-fledged star, like our sun. This is called the main sequence star, and I'm associating that with the point 3 on the Enneagram. The reason is because a main sequence star has ignited thermonuclear fusion in its core, so it generates its own energy, and that energy creates the outward pressure that pushes against gravity and keeps the star relatively intact. That's another kind of hydrostatic equilibrium. At this point, however, the protostar hasn't ignited that process of fusion yet, and so the protostar is a bit like a spark that hasn't quite ignited the ignition yet, hasn't ignited the engine yet. That spark, however, is enough in and of itself to create the counterbalancing force. And what's happening is that as gravity is pulling the material in, all of that dust and gas and all the atoms begin rubbing up against each other. All this friction is being created as things are being drawn to a central point. That friction is actually a result of things falling into the center. It's a result of the release of potential gravitational energy. So that gravitational energy is being released as heat. It's being radiated out as heat. And what's happening is that as gravity is moving the stuff inward, the heat being released by that stuff is kind of exerting an outward force. And what is eventually going to happen is that those two forces are going to come into a new state of balance, a new state of hydrostatic equilibrium. We can usually only see the protostar when a solar wind blows away the gas and dust. This wind, sometimes called a Titori wind, announces a shift from the protostar accreting mass into a stage when it's radiating energy. This is what I'm going to be associating later with the point 2 or the type 2. Because the process of early star formation is still somewhat opaque, it's not clear to us exactly what's going on, when and where and how and what's causing it, I'm going to be assigning different qualities of early star formation to the point 1 or the type 1 and other qualities to the point 2 or the type 2. Generally speaking, the type 1 is going to be the earlier stages, the class 0 stage, so-called, of the protostar formation, whereas the point 2 or the type 2 I'm going to be associating with what's known as the pre-main sequence stage. The protostar phase is an incredibly important formative stage in the life cycle of a star. It's in this stage that a star's mass is being determined, and the star's mass is its destiny, as we'll see as we move around the points of the Enneagram. In fact, a star's endurance in its full life cycle is going to depend on its initial mass, which is being determined in this protostar phase. So one could say that the gravitational pressure and the contraction of the protostar in that initial phase is related to its life, its flourishing, its longevity. For example, if the protostar does not get massive enough or dense enough to ever reach the conditions needed for thermonuclear fusion in its core, in other words, to ignite hydrogen fusion, then the star essentially bows out of the star's life cycle. It becomes what's called a brown dwarf. So all of this gravitational contraction, all of the pressure that's causing all of the gas and the dust from the surrounding cloud to infall into that dense knot at the center, that protostar at the center, all of that heat that's being released, these are all part of the conditions which are going to potentially give life to the star, actually birth it into a full-fledged star. The quality bridging the protostar with the point 1 and the type 1 on the Enneagram is a quality I'm calling impressure. It includes constraining or standing against reality. Impressure is an archaic word for impression, and this calls to mind several associations. Just as that protostar is formed in that cauldron of pressure, that cauldron of gravitational pressure and contraction, along with the outward pressure of heat being released, so also the point 1, the type 1, represents that initial stroke, that initial impression. And we all know how important an initial impression is. That initial impression is a formative offering that eventually shapes the entire way a particular relationship is going to go. So also, a baby's first impression, say in their holding environment, the conditions of the holding environment, or a baby's first impression in all those facial recognitions that the baby is seeing and imprinting within the baby's neurological system. All of those first impressions are going to be so important, as we all know, to the life and the flourishing of that baby, flourishing into maturation. And so another feature I'm associating with impressure is a kind of sharpness of spark. It's as if the intensity of that spark is going to determine the intensity of ignition, the intensity and longevity of the initial fire. The point 1 for all of us represents the sharpness of that initial spark, that initial impression. And included within that is a kind of standing against reality, that process of forming an initial boundary, setting that initial intention, coming into being, coming out of an undifferentiated presence, which is represented by the point 9, and into some kind of embryonic form of differentiation, kind of embryonic form of knowing, of being, of perceiving. All of those things that are going to eventually result in a kind of individuated consciousness, reality knowing itself. The first cognitive fixation I'm highlighting with respect to the type 1 is disciplining, bringing about a state of order and obedience. The earliest stages of star formation are marked by a kind of chaos. The tranquility of the molecular cloud has been disturbed by that cosmological event, that shock wave, for example, from a supernova, and that's created a disturbance in all of the forces. They're out of balance. And the ensuing happening is that all of that dust and gas is in a kind of free fall, in a collapse toward the center, that gravitational point in the middle, that dense knot that forms the protostar. And so this initial stage is marked by a kind of, one could say, disciplining in a sense. It's an attempt to bring these forces back into balance. So also the type 1 is kind of obsessed with bringing chaotic urges within the type 1 structure under control, in order, disciplining the natural instinctual drives of energy into a kind of structure. And the type 1 does this in order to bring about order out of this chaos, bring about a kind of obedience of all of these chaotic forces. And this can also be turned out to in a particular environment. The one can be attempting to order things around in any given situation, including maybe even other people, trying to bring order and structure to a rather chaotic world. And the ones have a gift for this kind of organizing, this kind of bringing order. And yet it can also overfunction. It can start to turn into a kind of criticality that's being spread around to everybody, and a kind of difficult environment that's actually dampening down people's energy and their spirits. Related to this point, I'm also including within disciplining a kind of chastising or correcting or punishing by way of correction. The type 1 structure habitually chastises, either chastises him or herself, or chastises other people, or chastises situations, chastises public policy, whatever the case may be. There's a habitual movement to a kind of correcting of things. Things aren't quite fitting. They're not quite properly ordered. There's too much chaos. There's too much things that are out of control. And so the one is attempting through this chastising, through this correcting, even kind of punishing, to bring a sense of order, really for the good of everyone, for one's own good. And this can also come in the form of a kind of subtly radiated anger. And the protostar, what's happening is as all of this infalling material is coming together through the rotation of the protostar in the center of that collapsing cloud, there's a kind of heat that gets radiated in all directions. It eventually forms into a line and it forms into an outflow, which I'm going to associate the outflow with the point 2, but initially this heat goes out in all directions. And so similarly, the type 1 can radiate a kind of heat, a kind of feeling of criticality into a situation. And it can make everyone who's in the ambit of that heat feel kind of guilty, feel kind of challenged or criticized in some way. And so this can really make a huge impact in any situation that the one finds him or herself in. Finally included in disciplining is training to act in accordance with a regimen of rules. The type 1 structure is under intense pressure, self-pressure, to be good. The type 1 knows very well that constraint is necessary for flourishing, is necessary for happiness. And so the one is putting him or herself, usually, under such pressure to bring about that flourishing. And this pressure, this constraining, takes the form of disciplining. And this disciplining relates to a kind of enacting an internal standard of what it means to be good, what it means to be right or moral, what it means to be virtuous. And this standard, this regimen, gets enacted meticulously. The one is going around seeing how things could be better in accordance with the one's one right way of the way things should be done. And this is a kind of discipline, not only of oneself, but it turns out it kind of spills out onto other people. Because related to this disciplining and disciplining in general is the one sort of denial of their pleasure. There's too much work to be done. We have to continue to be responsible. How can we go off and be irresponsible, have fun and enjoy ourselves when there's so much to be done? And this can spill over into a kind of resentment toward other people who are having fun, who are enjoying life, who are indulging in some kind of pleasure. There's a sense in which the one is resentful towards these irresponsible ones. It's like the one is the only responsible one, the only one that's staying in accordance with the standards, with the procedures, with the internal or external regimen of discipline that's necessary in order to bring about order and civilization in the world, to bring about ultimately flourishing, not only for the oneself, but for all of the world, for society. The other cognitive fixation I'm highlighting with respect to the type 1 is aligning, arranging into or falling into line. Aligning is critical in the process of star formation, and in the phase of the protostar, this aligning can be seen quite literally in the formation of a line of energy, shooting out either side of its poles. This line of energy is thought to be related to the energy that's being released, the excess energy from all of the infalling material, all that dust and gas that's falling down into that central clump that becomes the protostar. Now this energy, the mechanism for the aligning of this energy is a little unclear, but it's thought that in the earliest stages, it's somehow related to the protostar's own magnetic field. It's a kind of self-alignment that's happening with the protostar. It's such a perfect metaphor for the aligning that's happening with the type 1. The type 1 is aligning his or her own energy in accordance with internal standards of what it means to be good, the internal sense of the necessary constraint that leads to flourishing. And it's true for all of us that we, as a part of our growth, our psychological growth, our spiritual growth, it's important to come into alignment. It's important to come into integrity. And integrity is such a key word for the point 1 in all of us. We come into integrity, into alignment of, for example, the energy of the 3 centers, the head, the heart, and the body or the gut. We also come into alignment, into integrity with other people. So there's an integrity, an aligning of what's going on inside with how we're presenting outside. Another aspect of aligning is adjusting or improving. At its best, the type 1 structure has a gift for moral clarity, a gift for objectivity, a gift for seeing what's out of alignment and bringing it into alignment. In doing so, for the flourishing of everyone, the goodness of everyone. And this gift then starts to overfunction, where the type 1 habitually aligns, habitually evaluates what's not right, habitually looks for those things that are disjointed and tries so hard, works so hard to bring them into alignment, either within the oneself or within any given situation. And it's this kind of overfunctioning that takes the form of criticality and perfectionism and all the things that I've already mentioned that creates a kind of rigidity and a kind of constriction that actually works against flourishing. Finally, aligning can include joining with others in a common cause. Type 1s can be genuinely self-sacrificing, genuinely and earnestly working so hard for the improvement of the world, for the betterment of the world. And in so doing, type 1s like to align with others who are trying to bring about goodness, align with a tradition or a social cause or kind of politics that's going to help improve the world, bring about an improvement. This can overfunction to the extent that the type 1 can then be a bit of a crusader in this zealousness for social reform. And just like a crusader can kind of justify any of his or her actions in the name of the greater good, the one can start to enact a kind of hypocritical behavior with respect to their so-called aligning, their so-called virtuous behavior. Everything is justified because I'm the virtuous one. I'm the one trying to bring about good for people. And so all kinds of activities can get justified with this, pointing to this virtuous intention. The passion of the one is anger, a strong feeling of displeasure and belligerence aroused by a perceived wrong. Anger is an energetic agitation, a friction, a heat associated with feeling bitter, indignant, or aggrieved at, and it usually involves a perceived violation of boundaries. Point 1 represents for all of us that journey out of undifferentiated presence, out of unity, out of sameness, out of the holding environment, and into differentiation. And this process is done through constraint, through constriction. And that constraint and that constriction leads to a sense of a boundary. Once we have boundaries, we have a sense that our boundaries can be violated. And its anger is so closely related to the perceived violation of a boundary. But anger for the passion of the type 1 also relates to the formation of the boundary. For the boundary is formed by a kind of anger against anger. The way this works is that our raw energy anger in its purest form is simply raw energy. It's simply the chaotic movement and flow of energy in the universe. And yet, the one, in order to create that constraint, create that boundary, has a kind of anger against that free flow. It's a sort of constriction of anger energy. And so the one sort of stands against anger, and in so doing, enacts anger. And to me, this is reminiscent of how the protostar gets formed, because in that sort of chaos of unbalanced forces, when the cloud is beginning to collapse into that core point, it's actually gravity that's causing the collapse, and yet it's gravity that causes the outward push against that collapse. How so? Because all of the infalling material is releasing potential gravitational energy. The release of that potential gravitational energy is actually heat that's being radiated. So the heat being released by the infalling material is exactly the force that then prevents further collapse. It's the force that stands against gravity. So it's a kind of gravity against gravity, if you will. At least that's my understanding of it. In any event, the point is that for all of us, the journey is to, for that type 1, to move beyond that sense of standing against, move beyond that sense of irritation and friction at things not being quite right, into a state of calmness, a state of serenity, a state of allowing the process to unfold just as it is. No matter what flaw might be seen or imperfection, it's all part of a greater perfection that can be tuned into. And once we hold this process of formation, this process of coming into differentiation, in that state of calm abiding, we can then maximize the potential for goodness to be seen, to be recognized, to be brought about in the world. We can maximize the potential for flourishing for ourselves and for the world.